Morning, and I'm sorry I can't be with you this morning, but I've left you in very capable hands. I'm just producing this short introductory video to give you a flavour of some of the things I would have talked about had I been with you. If you've got any questions, you're welcome to ask Sneska, or you can ask me. I'll be back with you tomorrow morning. But this week we're starting on the new topic. We're starting on Visual Basic. So I'm going to introduce you to a few different things around Visual Basic in Excel. You'll remember from some of the early lectures that we looked at that Visual Basic is a programming language. It sits in lots of programs, so there's other modelling programs that you'll use later on in your degree that will use or could use Visual Basic if you wanted them to. It sits in the background somewhere and you can get it to do things and link programs together. But for now we're looking at it in Excel purely because we're building on what we've already done. The language, when you look at other programs, is constructed in exactly the same way. So let's look at some of the basic things we need to do. First off, you're going to need to go into Excel. So if I open a new Excel document, on the top ribbon you're going to need this Developer tab to be showing up. Now, it may not show up by default. So what you're going to have to do is go into your options, so File and Options, and go down to Customize Ribbon, and then make sure that the Developer tab, that tick box is ticked. That will then enable you to view all the developer tools, and the main one you're going to be looking at is Visual Basic. Okay, there is a short video talking you through some of the activities I've put together already, so I'm not going to repeat that, but I will show you where that is in a few minutes. So now we've got our Visual Basic toolbar, our developer toolbar open. Let me just talk you through some of the other things that I've provided you with that you can work through this morning. So back in our learning materials in week 9, there are 4 things. There's the workbook that's fairly standard for you by now and you should be familiar with. I've provided a Visual Basic example file, and then there are 2 links to external websites, and I'll talk through what both of those do. So in the workbook we have some recommended reading as usual. We've got the 2 paid for books. We've got the 2 booklets, PDFs that are available online that I've provided links for, and it tells you where to look in those for your different bits of information on Visual Basic. And we've also got the 2 links to the external websites again, so it's telling you where to go. The first part is talking you through what I've already just done and making the Developer tab visible. So this first step, making the Developer tab visible. When you go into the Developer tab, there's a button called Visual Basic. You can access it by pushing Alt and F11 on the keyboard as well. That's a shortcut. So in my Visual Basic tab, I've got different layouts for the different workbooks that are open. But ultimately, I've got 2 different things. There's a folder with some worksheets in it, and a workbook, and then there's something called modules. So if I want to write some Visual Basic code, I can write it and apply it to a specific sheet in my workbook, and it only runs on that sheet. Or I can apply it to the whole workbook, and it will apply to it can run on any sheet if I choose to make it do so. Or I can make it as a standalone module, so I can insert a new module, and that will allow me to run the code, and I can move that module between workbooks, so that's slightly more useful. Okay, so probably for the most part you're going to be writing your code and your script in modules, in these module boxes. The other place you can do it is when you right click on modules, you can insert a user form. So you've now got a form instead. So you can design that form, and that can be designed for inputting data and then for storing it somewhere and doing some calculations. So you can have your module write your code in your module, or you can design something graphically, and then when I right click on that, I can view the code, and I can add my code in here instead. Okay, so two different places where it's relatively useful to write your Visual Basic code. If you want to write it just on the sheet, that's absolutely fine, but you've got to remember it won't move between the sheets. Okay, so this is what Visual Basic looks like in Excel. In terms of, well, what are we actually going to write? Before you even start going into forms and modules, what I suggest you do is you go to some of these recommended links. So the first one that I recommend after making the tools visible is going to this first link here, the tutorials point one. Tutorials point has a huge host of different resources available. So it's a very good library of bits of script to reference, almost a dictionary. So I'd recommend that you read through some of the first bits, so particularly the home, the overview, a little bit on macros, possibly some on the Excel terms as well. And then as you start to work through, it starts to give you an idea of some of the things you can do. So for instance, a message box. And it gives you a basic layout for what the script will look like. It tells you what each bit of that script does. And then it tells you the different parameters that the button can take. So depending on what happens, you'd use a different value. Okay. And then it gives you an example of that function being used. So it builds it up step by step. Everything in green with a little apostrophe at the start is a piece of text. So in the example I've given you, I haven't provided lots of code in my worksheet because I provided it in the Visual Basic script, but I'll show you that in a moment. So you can just copy and paste these separate functions, these separate sub-procedures into a Visual Basic window, and you can get them working and running, and you can play with that if you want to, and it will show you what you should get on the output. Okay, so I would recommend, in order to get familiar, just to start with Visual Basic, you start looking through some of these. Start getting some of these to do what it says it should do. Use the examples and then start to edit them a little bit. Okay. As you get further in, I don't recommend you work all the way down the list. As you get further in, you're going to want to be doing things specific for an engineering task. So when you get to some of the tasks later on in the workbook, then you're going to want to pick out specific things, a bit like the functions in Excel. There's lots of functions and lots of bits of script in here. So for instance, the if statement is a bit of a decision. So in Excel, if we said if a particular criteria was met, then we wanted to show one value, otherwise we wanted to show another value. We can do the same in Visual Basic, and we have a little flowchart at the start which shows us, well, what's the if statement, what's this decision process looking like. But there's lots of different ways that we can go. We can have just an if statement, so if a criteria is met, do something. We can have what we're more familiar with in Excel, if a criteria is met, do something else, do something else. We can have an if, otherwise if, or else if, so two different criteria nested together, or we can nest lots of if statements together. But if I just click one of those, the one we're more familiar with, so it gives you a rough layout of what might be looked like when you copy it into the code. So an outline. There's a bit of a flow diagram showing the specific function you're looking at, but then there's a really useful example of what's happening, and then it describes what that code above is trying to do. Okay, So I'd recommend you look through the first early bits of this website, the overview, the macros, the terms, the comments, and then start looking. Don't read all the way to the end of this website. Start looking at some of the other tasks that I'm setting you. And as you go through those tasks, jump back in here and look at this a bit like a dictionary, where you're looking for little bits of script that you can borrow and edit and adapt. The other website that I provided has a series of articles that you might want to dip into at the beginning if you've never seen Visual Basic before in your life. There's things like the Ultimate Visual Basic Tutorial Part 1. It's quite useful. It's quite useful for a very, very simple introduction. It talks about things like how to create a module, how to use subs as subroutines, sub-procedures. It talks about some of the code that you might, some of the simple code you might use, that you might want to use built into the functions that you find on the other website. Okay. If this is seeming a little overwhelming, don't worry. I've also got an example file for you. So my example file, I've got, it's based on a statics problem, because you've all done statics, so I know it's something you're all familiar with. And in the statics problem, I've got two forces, an angle of a force and a resultant force. So force 1 is going in a particular direction, force 2 is at an angle, and there's a resultant force because of the combination of those two. They're all being stored here, so you can see in the formula bar, they're all there as numbers. There's no functions, no formulae in there at all. But if I click on my rectangle, okay, bear with me 1 minute. There we go. Don't forget to enable your macros. If I click on my rectangle, this is a user form that's popped up for me to enter my values in. So you can see I've dropped a little image of the statics problem I'm working on. I've said, well, the first force is 100 newtons. The second force going up this angle here, let's call that 55 newtons, and let's make that angle up to be, I don't know, 56 degrees. If I click submit, it recalculates everything in that sheet. It gives me a new resultant force, but there's no formulae doing that calculation. Let's have a look how we've done that. So in my VBA project, I've got a couple of sheets, but there's no code in there. All the code is in the forms and the modules. So let's open that form that we were just working on. So the form we were just working on is sat here. I've got a series of text boxes. These are just labels. They're not going to change. They're fixed. You're not going to type into those. I've got a series of white boxes which we've made from this toolbox down here. So the toolbox is where we drag everything in from. So I can add another text box, and you can see it looks just like these. When I'm running the form, I can enter text into here. Each of these text boxes is given a name by default. So the one I've just made on the properties bar, properties window, is called text box 1. Now, it's this name that is useful. So and is important. So I've changed my names to F1 for the first one, because it's full force 1. I've changed the second one to F2. I've changed the third one to F2A. Now, if I was to add force 3, I would need to add 3 more boxes based on this diagram. I'd need one for the magnitude of force 3, one for the X component of the little triangle, and one for the Y component of the little triangle. I will let you add those, and that might be a good activity to practice with. But if we go to view code, right click on it and view code, what I've done is I've written the code to make that calculation work, and as I've written that code I have added some lines of text. So all of the green text is not necessary, it's in place of the workbook. So the notes in the workbook are less because I've added the text in situ with the code, so you can see what's happening a line at a time. You can see and work your way through and work out what is that code doing. Every time there's a horizontal line, there's a new sub procedure. So we can see starts with sub, ends with end sub, and there's a name for that sub procedure. So everything, all of these individual procedures, I will let you work out what they're doing. This last one at the end is doing nothing, so we can delete it. Okay. I'm not going to talk you through those because the other video that I provided somewhere, oops, competing videos. The other video that I provided should talk you through that. The other video I provided doesn't appear to be uploaded, so I will upload that and make it available to you. So maybe I will talk you through those things now. So we've got the first sub procedure is just opening a series of blank text boxes. So every text box that we've put on, it makes sure that it hasn't got the previous values we entered in there, and it opens them as blank. And that's it, that's the first sub procedure. The second sub procedure is linked to the submit button. So submit underscore click. Well, underscore click means it's recognising it's looking for a click, and I'll just minimize that for a minute. The submit button, the buttons are again made from the toolbox. There's a button option, and the name of it again is important because submit is the name of the button. It's not important what the label is. The actual word on the button, the caption, I can make anything. The name of the button is what's used in the Visual Basic code. So I can go through and I can say when I click submit, it's going to sheet 1 activate, so it's going to look to sheet 1 of my workbook. If I rename the tabs in my workbook, it won't matter, it's still looking to sheet 1 because the tab will be renamed over on the left, but the actual sheet will still retain its original name. So it's looking to sheet 1, and then it's taking the value, so it's the value in F1, F1 being the first text box if you remember. If it's not blank, then it's going to range B1, and it's making the value in range B1 of the sheet we activated equal to whatever is in F1. Okay, so taking the value of the box F1, if it's not blank, making the value in cell B1 of the active sheet equal to whatever is in our text box. That's an if statement, that's the whole thing. The second trio of lines, triplet I've called it, that's doing the same thing but for F2. The only difference is, rather than saying range B1 dot value, I've said cells 22 dot value. So that's going to be row and then column, but it's going to be B2, cell B2. I've just done it in a different way. Okay, purely to show you there are different ways of doing things in the code. There is no one right way. And the third one takes the value of F2A, so my angle, the third text box. So it takes the value from this third text box, F2A, and if it's not blank, then it's going to place it into cell B3 on our active sheet, sheet 1. So when I hit submit, that's the first thing it does. And whoops, not on the blank workbook it doesn't. That's the first thing it does. So in sheet 1, it drops F1, F2 and F2A into those 3 boxes. So whatever I type, it drops them in those boxes and stores them. The next thing it does is it says unload me. That closes down the whole form, but it doesn't stop the script from running. That sub-procedure is still running. So I've taken what was in my 3 text boxes, F1, F2 and F2A, and I've stored it in 3 cells in my sheet. The sheet that I activated right at the beginning, sheet 1. I now want to pull those numbers back, and I want to say, right, let's do some calculation with them. So I've defined some variables. So I've defined pi. I defined pi because I can't remember how to call pi back up. I'm sure pi is a function in Visual Basic, but I couldn't remember the command for it at the time. I've then defined F1, F2 and F2A. So I've given them the same names as the text boxes, but the command, the procedure, can't remember what they were because I've closed that form and unloaded everything. It's forgotten everything. So I've got to call them back from the active sheet. So I've defined pi. I've said force 1 is whatever is in cell B1. Force 2 is whatever's in cell B2. And force 2 angle, the angle that force 2 was at, is in whatever is in cell B3. And I've just added this last bit on the end to convert to radians, because Excel and Visual Basic both prefer to work in radians. Okay, so that's pulling in the information from the worksheet and defining pi. So first, the early bits, we're storing the information. We're taking whatever we typed, the user typed, and storing the information in a worksheet. We close the form, and then we call that information back from the worksheet into the sub-procedure. This is not the only way to do this. This is showing you multiple steps so that you can then look to simplify it. There are easier ways, but this is showing you in a relatively logical step-by-step process if you're not comfortable with Visual Basic for the first time. So I've got my variables defined, the bits that I would be given in a diagram. I then have to do some of my forces in the x direction, which is going to be for this, if we're only looking at force 1 and force 2 to start with, is going to be minus F2 times cos F2A. And forces in the y direction, which is going to be F2 sine F2A plus F1. Now obviously if force 3 was in there, there'd be other components in both the x and the y. We then find a resultant force, which I've called FR, and that's using Pythagoras. And then we store that in cell B4. So if I go back to my worksheet, in cell B4, there's our resultant force being stored. And the final bit, we work out our angle theta, and for our resultant force, and then we store that, converting it back to degrees. We store it in cell B5, and that is where the sub-procedure ends. So when I click submit, all of that runs, and then the sub-procedure ends. The last 2 sub-procedures are linked to the last 2 boxes. So we've got a cancel and a clear button. Cancel just closes the form, so it's unload me, it's nothing new, it's the same command we've seen before. So you've opened the form, you didn't mean to, you click cancel. And the final one, clear, just takes whatever's in sheet 1, all those cells, B1 to B5, and clears them. So it clears all my stored data for me. And that's all of the code in that worksheet, in that user form. Okay. The only other piece worth looking at is this oval button. The oval button has plotted a graph. Not a useful graph, I grant you, but it's plotted a graph. It's remembered how to plot the graph. It's remembered the axes that I want, whether I want grid lines. It's remembered the title of my graph, which is rather unoriginal as blah. But it's remembered it all because it's all stored in a module. So module 2 has all of the information for plotting the graph that I suggested I wanted. I did not remember and write all of that. I didn't even look all that up because there's other ways of making a module and writing that code. So the other way of doing it is to record a macro. So macros can be recorded. There's a little button in the bottom left and it says no macros are currently recording. If I click on it, it gives me an option to record a macro. So I can give it a name. I can give it a shortcut key if I want to. I don't normally do that because I normally forget them if I do give it to them. If it's something you're using regularly, you were using it for a project or something, a shortcut key is not a bad thing. I'll store it in this workbook, and if I'm making lots of them I might want a description, but I'm going to leave this one. So now you can see my logo, my symbol in the bottom left has changed to a stop sign. So it's currently recording, so anything I do, it will record. So I can go all the way back to my first cells, and I can copy, I can jump over here, and I can paste, and then I can stop. Let's delete that. And that will have created a new module where it says, based on where I was, it remembered that I even had to scroll, so it scrolls a little bit, and so it scrolls, moves position both up and down and left and right. Then it highlights specific cells A1 to D4, copies that selection, puts the cursor in cell I1, and then pastes. So it's remembered all of those steps. So if I then were to create another shape, you can make this look a lot neater than I have. Let's do that. I can right click, I can assign a macro, and I can call it name. When I click that, it does the same copy and paste as previously. Okay. So that's how you'd assign a macro. The bit that you didn't see right at the start was how to make the form actually launch on a button. That can be quite useful. So launching the form on a button, if I close down some of these, is just, I've called it go, and the actual command is just the name of the user form, so user form 1, and .show. So I've called it go, and then I've assigned that go macro. I assigned the macro go to that rectangle. The graph one is obviously assigned to the oval. Okay, that's probably just about all I want to talk to you about for now. The only thing that you do need to know is saving it before I forget. When you save it, you need to save as, and there are two formats that you can save it in. Save it either as an Excel macro enabled workbook or an Excel binary workbook. If you only save it as an XLSX, so only as the default file format, then you're going to lose all of your macros. So you want it as macro enabled or binary. And I'll talk about some of the advantages of binary over the macro enabled tomorrow. But either will be absolutely fine for everything we're going to do. Okay. I'm not going to save it because that will overwrite everything I had before. Okay. So tasks I think you should be working on now. Step 1, if you have never seen Visual Basic and you want some extra support, extra introductory material, use this VBA articles, look through the complete guide, but particularly the ultimate, there you go, the ultimate guide part 1, there is a part 2, look through some of the others if they're useful. Okay. When you've had a look through some of those introductory guides, have a look through the first few pages of our tutorial point website that I've found. So look through the home page, the overview, the start on macros, some of the basic terms that we're talking about. What is a module? What is a procedure? What is a function? What is a sub-procedure? Look through those pages, get to grips with some of the terms. Have a go maybe at the message box and the input box, try and get it to give some simple pop-up messages. And then, if you're getting a bit more comfortable with macros, or you can start here if you're already comfortable. Then you can go into my example. You can take this user form and you can try and edit it to get F3 and F3X and F3, the Y bit. You can add those 3 extra text boxes and try and get them factored into the calculation and affecting the resultant force. So that's a task for you. And then finally, if you get to all of those things, there is a final task here where we're looking at developing another calculation completely separate, but based on some material properties, looking at stresses and strains. Okay, that should be plenty for you to work through. You've got, I mean, the video is just over half an hour, which was slightly longer than intended, but you know that's normally how I end up doing things. So you've got about an hour and a half, just under, because you'll be going to maths. That should be plenty for you to do. I'll be back tomorrow, but if you've got any questions, you can ask Sneska today, you can ask myself tomorrow. Hopefully that's okay and gives you plenty of resources to work through, and lots to do, and you'll have a fun time doing it. Good luck, and I'll see you tomorrow.